Okay, welcome everyone to the October meeting of the Memphis Horticultural Society. And I'm really pleased to have tonight's program for you, which is our speaker is someone that I would say she's a familiar face, but because of a camera problem, her face isn't too familiar tonight. But I know you've seen her because she is a frequent speaker in the area. She's spoken to our group before. She's done the Master Gardeners and some of the other groups. And you may, if you go to the Lichterman Nature Center, you've definitely seen her. So our speaker tonight is Mary Schmidt, and she is the curator of the Backyard Wildlife Center at Lichterman Nature Center here in Memphis. Mary has had a long time passion for connecting people with the natural world, which goes back to her childhood when she led her siblings on hikes through the forest and creek around her home near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. That later led her to earn a bachelor's degree in biology and biodiversity, and working for governmental and nonprofit organizations in such diverse ecosystems as Kansas, Hawaii, Maryland, and eventually here in the Mid-South in Tennessee. And she spends her free time doing what she loves: birding, gardening, spending time outdoors with her husband and daughter. And tonight we are going to talk about butterflies. So let me turn this over to Mary.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for having me back. I'm really excited to talk to you guys today about not only monarchs, but some of the other Mid-South butterflies that we're seeing now and maybe in the springtime as well. If you're not familiar with Lichterman Nature Center, we are an urban nature center. We're located on Quince Road in East Memphis, and we're also a certified arboretum. We are in a place that houses non-releasable wildlife like the big alligator snapping turtle you see here. And then, as a lot of you are definitely aware, we grow a lot of plants that are native and wildlife friendly on site. But what we're here to talk about today are butterflies. And this is one of my favorite photos that was taken maybe about 10 years ago. This is a group of tiger swallowtails puddling. And so we're going to talk about butterflies today. A little bit more specifically, we're going to talk about the difference between butterflies and moths. That's always a common question that we get. We'll talk about the life cycle of butterflies, some Mid-South butterflies and how to identify them. And then we'll talk about planting for butterflies a little bit. A lot of this is what you guys are already doing. So there might just be some tips in there to increase the number and the diversity of butterflies that you're already seeing in your own gardens. So we're going to be talking about the order of butterflies and moths called Lepidoptera. And I like to kind of remind everybody, because sometimes people in the biology world throw out the kingdom and phylum, class order, stuff like that. But I wanted to just kind of refresh you back to maybe junior high biology, where it's the classification system that goes from a big group down into a smaller group until we get to species. So butterflies and moths both fall into the same order, which is Lepidoptera, which literally translate to scaled wing, which butterflies and moths wings are covered in scales. Most of them, as caterpillars, eat plants and nectar as adults when they're butterflies or moths, but not all of them. And we'll talk about some really interesting examples that are right here in the Mid-South too. 175,000 species worldwide, about 12,000 of those in the United States. It makes them the second most diverse insect order. So I'll give you a second to think about what you think the most diverse insect order is. So time's up. It's actually beetles. Beetles is the most diverse insect order. And there's, I think, around like 800,000 beetles. So those are that 175,000 species is both our butterflies and our moths. And a lot of times, because butterflies are what we talk about most of the time, we think that they're the most abundant, but only about 10% of those are actually classified as butterflies. The rest of them are going to be moths. So moths are actually way more diverse than butterflies. In the United States, we have about 700 species of butterflies and about 11,000 species of moths. Here in Tennessee, we have about 124 species of butterflies and probably over 2,000 species of moths. Moths always get a bad rap, so I like to give them a little bit of attention during the program. So looking at the difference between the two, really what we find out is the more we learn about this order, the less clear that distinction between moths and butterflies is. But without getting into like kind of really technical stuff, there are some things that you can typically observe in butterflies that you don't necessarily see in moths. But butterflies tend to have the following characteristics. So most of the time they are daytime. This is an example that is actually a nighttime butterfly, and it's was first classified as a moth, but then genetics determined it was a butterfly. So there is a little bit of confusion, but most butterflies are active during the daytime. Most butterflies are really colorful as well. And one of the most important distinctions that you can see is going to be their clubbed antenna. So looking at their antenna, we'll first start with butterflies. So this is the antenna of a butterfly. And as you can see, it kind of looks like a golf club. Okay. With a moth, it's more feather-like, kind of like a feather, or sometimes even like a feather duster, where those are, it's kind of a little bit more clumped. And then we have a butterfly called skippers, and they're kind of, they're classified as butterflies, but they're a little bit different, and they have kind of hooked antenna. So most of the time, if you can get a look at the antenna, you can tell if it's a butterfly, a moth, or a skipper. So here's a picture of some moths that are found right here in the Mid-South. And these are some really unique examples. So one, just overall, you can see that moths aren't just drab grays and browns. They can actually be pretty colorful. There are also some daytime, whoops, let me go back there. There's also some daytime ones. So this one, a lot of people call this a hummingbird moth because it resembles a hummingbird. A lot of people will say like a baby hummingbird, but it's actually a daytime flying moth. It belongs to a group of moths called clear wings because they've got some clear patches here. And also sometimes they're referred to as hawk moths, but those are a daytime flying moth. And if you looked really close, like with a magnifying glass, you would see here that it is actually more feather-like and not club-like. This is a really unique shaped one. This is a sphinx moth. And it's still pretty colorful as well. And then the Luna moth, which is one of our largest moths that we can get here in the Mid-South. They belong to a group called the silk moths, and those are the really big ones that we see. And just an interesting side note about those moths, as adults, they typically only live a few days, maybe a week, in the adult form or in the moth form. And that's because they don't have mouth parts to feed. Most of their life is spent as caterpillars. And as they become adults, their only goal is to be finding a mate and laying eggs if it's a female. So some of the moths are really short-lived and only really don't even have mouth parts. So caterpillars are really interesting too, in the diversity of caterpillars. So just like we see a diversity in the moths and the butterflies, a lot of those caterpillars are really diverse too. So there are a couple that you want to stay away from. So the ones here are marked with the no sign. Those are ones that are actually can cause some damage. They can have venom in their spines. And so those are the 3 venomous caterpillars that you can encounter. I always recommend to people to not pick up caterpillars unless you know what that caterpillar is. Even if you know it's not one of the 3 that are venomous, some people can react to different caterpillars. So gypsy moth caterpillars, I know some people have little reactions to those too if they get touched by them. This other one here is a really interesting one. This one is called a hickory horn devil, and it is a little bit longer than your finger, and they're super intimidating. They've got all these horns coming off of the back of their head, but they are totally harmless. And they tend to spend, I think, about 2 years underground feeding until they emerge, I think, as a moth. This is another really interesting one. This is a camouflage loper. And what's interesting is they will take parts of whatever plant they're on and kind of attach it to their body so that they blend in with their surroundings, which is a really cool adaptation. So talking about life cycles, butterflies are a great way to learn about life cycles, but also to teach about life cycles. And I'm going to give you this example of a Gulf fritillary. This is an entire life cycle that you can see in one season in your backyard just by planting their host plant and a few nectar sources. So Gulf fritillaries only lay eggs on Passionvine, one of our state wildflowers. And they're kind of a orangish color with black spikes. So you can see the caterpillar here. After about a week to 10 days, they will actually get into a J shape. This one happened to be during a rainstorm, and I didn't think he was going to make it because he was just hanging there. But later he kind of picked his head up a little bit to be more in a J shape. The next day we went out and it had already formed its chrysalis. So you'll hear me use the word chrysalis. Chrysalis is what a butterfly forms. A cocoon is what a moth forms. They do form them different ways, but there is a difference between what a butterfly emerges from and what a moth emerges from. So chrysalis is what we refer to when we're talking about butterflies. So in its chrysalis stage there, and then we actually got to see that butterfly emerge from the chrysalis. And so we were able to watch the entire life cycle. And if that wasn't cool enough, as we were watching this butterfly, and by we, I mean me and my 4-year-old daughter. So this is a great way to teach kids and grandkids about life cycles. And so as this butterfly emerged and she was drying her wings, which they have to pump fluid to the outside of their wings. And that's when they're able to fly. And lo and behold, here comes a male Gulf fritillary before she had even finished drying her wings. And that is this one down here. So he's mating with the female here who has just emerged. And so just really unique to watch that life cycle happen in one season in our backyard, which is, an urban backyard, like I think a lot of you all have as well. So just an interesting life cycle. And so butterflies do go through a complete metamorphosis. And what that means is they go from egg to larva. The larva is the caterpillar. That's the same thing. The pupa, which is also the chrysalis. And then finally to the adult butterfly. And so here's the Gulf fritillary life cycle, the general life cycle that we just talked about. So butterflies in the wintertime have to come up with a strategy to survive, just like most animals in the wintertime. And so butterflies are considered cold-blooded, which means that they can't regulate their temperature. They have to rely on what the outside temperature is. So butterflies need it to be at least 60 degrees and able to be active. So in the wintertime, that's not really our median temperature there. And that's actually a low estimate too. Most of the time it's 65 or 70 degrees before they can become active. They really prefer something in the 80 to 90 temperature range as well. So there's a few different strategies that that different species will go through. So first they can overwinter as an egg. And so most of the time those eggs a lot of times they are laid like in leaf litter. And so that adds some protection. They can overwinter as an adult, like this morning cloak here, which is really interesting. They go into something similar to hibernation, but it's more of a diapause in insects. And what that is basically it's just everything in their body kind of slows down so that they're able to survive without having to eat or anything like that. And sometimes on warm days, especially like in February, this is one of the first butterflies I start to see. These morning cloaks can sometimes be active in February if it's a warm couple days. That's not really typical for them to overwinter as adults. There are a few that we'll talk about too that actually overwinter as caterpillars, which is really interesting. And what they can do is they'll build this kind of leaf tunnel or shelter, and then the caterpillar will hang out inside of here throughout the winter. And then probably the most common strategy that we see here in the Mid-South for butterflies in the wintertime is they're overwintering as a chrysalis. And it's not always every generation that's overwintering. For example, this is a black swallowtail, and the first few generations of the season will emerge in about 14 days, but then the last generation will actually overwinter in its chrysalis form. And that's the most common thing that we see as a strategy for overwinter survival. However, there are some really interesting ones that we're going to talk about too that migrate. And for a long time, we didn't know that butterflies, or really a lot of insects like dragonflies, were migrating at all. And it wasn't really until we started to look more into the monarch. So this is a female monarch here, and she's actually laying her egg on milkweed, which is the only plant that they're going to lay on. Now there's a couple different species of milkweed, as I'm sure most of you are familiar with, but she is laying on milkweed. And then here's the different, what we call instars, or the different stages of caterpillars. So they about 2,000 times their original size when they emerge by the time they start to form their chrysalis. So just an amazing 2 weeks where they are just eating and eating and eating to get to that size. And of course, the only thing that they're eating is milkweed. So if you do want to see some monarch caterpillars, you have to have milkweed. It doesn't mean that if you don't have milkweed, you're not going to see monarch butterflies, but if you want to see the caterpillars, you've got to have milkweed. But what's really interesting about monarchs is their migration. So taking a look kind of at what their migration entails. So let's go back a few months to say February of this year. And there was a population down here in Mexico. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But so you've got this generation that's down in Mexico. And in about late February, they start to actually migrate to the Texas and Louisiana coast. So usually by about March, they're here. This original one here, so we'll call her the mother, she reaches the coast and typically dies after laying eggs. Her daughter then hatches from one of those eggs and continues to move north, which is when we start to see them like in March and April. The same process. She lives about 4 weeks, and her strategy is, as a butterfly, she lives 4 weeks. And her strategy is to find a mate and to lay eggs. And then that next generation, the granddaughter here, in June and July, is continued to move north, and she has laid her eggs maybe up here in Pennsylvania. And then finally, it's the great granddaughter of our original Mexican individual that is all the way up here in northern New York into southern Canada. And we call this the super generation, and they're typically starting up there in about August. And what's really cool is it's this generation. She's not typically going to mate and lay eggs. What she's going to do is instead of living 4 weeks, she's going to live maybe 6 months. And she's going to make the entire migration, or try to, all the way back down to Mexico. And just a few things like keep in mind, this is like 4 generations removed from the last monarch that migrated. And so how they know to go into that migration stage instead of breeding is one of the things that is really kind of a popular topic now in butterfly biology. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So on this super generation, this migration can take about 2 months. They're typically only flying 30 to 50 miles per day in just a few hours of that. The rest of the day, they're spent resting, warming, and feeding. And so it's really important, if you want to help monarchs along their migration, that they have nectar sources during this time, which is actually right now. This is starting at the end of September through this first week of October is actually the peak time of southern migrating monarchs to pass through the Memphis area. So be on the lookout for them. I did see one today. And they're going sometimes up to 3,000 miles on that journey. Along that journey, you've got lots of predators and lots of obstacles to overcome, including birds, insects, weather, pesticides, and starvation from not finding enough nectar sources. So you would think if this is an insect that weighs maybe a few paper clips, that it would just head straight south, that they can migrate just straight south. But to make it even more complicated for us to kind of figure out what they're doing, they don't go just south. They actually have courses that they take. And so some recent studies have suggested a few different navigational tools, including internal clocks, compound eyes, and actually riding thermals. What's interesting is there was a study done a few years ago that found that something in their antenna, it allows them to orient southward. So it's a really interesting study, but they know that it has something to do with their antenna. There are kind of two distinct populations of monarchs in North America, though. We've got the eastern population, which migrates down to Mexico, although they are starting to find some that are overwintering on the Florida coast. And then there's a western population west of the Rockies, and those are overwintering in Southern California. And I actually just did a monarch led a walk here at Lichterman Nature Center a few weeks ago and talked to somebody who lived in California and said that at some of those overwintering sites, you can go and just get covered in monarchs just hiking around on some of the trails. So here's where they're headed to in Mexico. If you look at this bottom picture here, this kind of dirty dust right here, that's actually monarchs. All of that orange is monarchs covering these trees. And that's how they actually study the population size, by how many hectares they are covering in Mexico. And so they do aerial flights and see how many hectares are kind of have this orange dust on it, which is actually all the monarchs. So monarchs are very specialized in where they're going. So they are only going to 12 mountaintops in Mexico, and that's where these little black areas here are the type of forest that they're going to. They only go to oyamel forest, which is a type of fir tree, and it only happens at elevations above 10,000 feet. So there's a lot of things that have to go right for the monarchs to get to these spots. I should show you too. Unfortunately, one of the issues that's happening on the overwintering grounds, as you can see here, is a lot of logging. So not only is it just that they're going to these 12 mountaintops, but they're only going to one specific tree there, and that's the oyamel fir tree, which you can see in the picture here. What makes that spot perfect for them is the microclimate. So it's warm enough to keep them alive, but it's cold enough to where they're very inactive. And so they huddle together on these fir trees and rarely come down to eat or to even get water. Some people suggest they are not eating at all on the overwintering grounds, but that they're just coming down for water. But regardless, they're not very active at all on their overwintering grounds. The way that we actually found out that they were migrating there was through a program that's coming soon to, or actually I think it's there right now at Mosh, formerly the Pink Palace. They are showing Flight of the Monarch, and it is basically about the man and woman who started doing this tagging program of putting these little stickers on monarchs to see if they could figure out where they were migrating to. And so it wasn't really until I think like 1983, around that time, that we found out that they were migrating all the way down to Mexico. People that were living in Mexico definitely knew they were migrating. Day of the Dead is actually coincides with monarch migration coming through that part of Mexico. And a lot of people think in Mexican cultures that the monarchs carry the souls of their loved ones. And so that coincides with their culture as well. But it wasn't until we started doing this program here, tagging the monarchs. It's still an ongoing program. We do it here at Lichterman. Unfortunately, I've been doing it for about 13 or 14 years, and the numbers have dropped drastically. So in the past like 3 decades, monarch populations have decreased by 90%. Okay, so let's move on to some other butterflies, because I know the monarchs get a lot of attention, and well-deserved, because their populations are definitely declining. But we want to talk about some other butterflies that we can see here in the Mid-South. So I'm going to split them into 2 different groups, our true butterflies and our skippers. So true butterflies are the ones that we think about. They're the swallowtails, the ones that are really big and showy. They're the whites and sulphurs, which are those white and yellow butterflies that if you have any sort of cabbage or broccoli growing, you're familiar with some of those. There's Gossamer Wings, which are little and bright. And then there's Brushfoots, which is kind of a catch-all category that's got a lot of different interesting butterflies lumped together. So starting out with the swallowtails, we have 6 in West Tennessee. and they're the large and showy ones. Most of them have tails, and the caterpillars have something called osmeteria, which are these right here. And what it is if you pick up that caterpillar, they have these two antenna-like projections that come out. And a lot of times they'll rear their head and try to touch whatever's grabbing them. And having been touched by this before, it's really kind of an offensive odor that comes from those two antenna-like projections. So this is a black swallowtail caterpillar here on, I think that's fennel, but if you plant fennel, dill, parsley, you'll almost definitely get black swallowtails in your garden. This is a black swallowtail, the adult butterfly, and there are a couple different large black butterflies. And so I'm going to try to point out a few differences on how to tell those two apart. So with the black swallowtail, what you want to look for when the wings are open are two lines of this white outline here on their wings. Okay. The other big swallowtails that we have are tiger swallowtails, right? So it's pretty self-explanatory on how they get the name tiger swallowtail. And zebra swallowtail, same thing. So we've got the stripes just like a zebra. This is our state butterfly actually here, which is pretty cool. And tiger swallowtails, most of the time are really easy to tell apart until, of course, there is a black form of the female tiger swallowtail. But something interesting about our state butterfly, the zebra swallowtail, is that their host plant is actually pawpaws. If you know anything about pawpaws, it's the largest native North American fruit, which is pretty cool. Pretty abundant here, grows pretty well. The fruits are edible, but when the caterpillars eat the leaves, the chemicals that are inside of the leaves actually protect them and make them somewhat toxic to especially bird predators. So even though the fruit's edible, the leaves have a chemical in them that protects the butterfly. The giant swallowtail, this is our largest butterfly in Tennessee. It's also on a wild bergamot here, which is one of our native plants. I don't see these a lot in West Tennessee. Their host plants tend to be in the citrus family. And so we don't have a lot of those here, but I've seen them a time or two, but they are a little bit more abundant, I think, in some other parts of the state. The Pipevine Swallowtail, this is really interesting. There's a great book that I'm going to put on the screen later called Butterflies of Tennessee by Rita Venable. And what's great about hers, it's a really great book if you want to get into butterflies here in Tennessee. She calls this butterfly the Elvis butterfly because there are so many impersonators of this butterfly. This butterfly is toxic to to birds especially. So birds are the main predator of butterflies. And so there are a number like the black swallowtail that we saw earlier that mimic the Pipevine swallowtail. And so she calls it in her book the Elvis butterfly because there's so many impersonators. And so it is Pipevine, Dutchman's pipe are some of its host plants. Oh, so this is another of those black ones. And this one is just going to have the one line of white dots when its wings are open, and then the one line of the orange with black around it dots whenever their wings are closed. Spicebush Swallowtail. If you have a spicebush in your garden, this is one of the butterflies that it can attract. This one has got two orange lines when its wings are closed. And then it's got the white and then kind of a smear of blue above it when its wings are open. These are the caterpillars. I love finding these caterpillars. I see them just about every year on a spice bush we have here at Lichterman Nature Center. And they have a unique strategy for survival. So this is an early instar or a young caterpillar. Let's see what that kind of looks like. It kind of looks like bird droppings, right? And so that's their strategy for being camouflaged when they're young. As they get older, they start to look more like this. And this is actually what they call a snake mimic. And so it's supposed to mimic a small snake with these two round eye spots here, when really their head or their eyes are at the tip of my pointer there. So those are just really interesting to find those caterpillars, and they have that interesting camouflage, and it changes from a young caterpillar to an old caterpillar. Okay, so now moving on to the whites and sulphurs. So these are almost always yellow, white, or orange, and they'll have some sort of accent color, black, orange, or green. They show sexual dimorphism, which is just a fancy way of saying the males and the females, or the boys and the girls, look different. And something else really interesting about this group of butterflies is they can look different based on the season. So a lot of them in the spring and early summer will be lighter in color. And then as the season progresses, the later generations will actually be darker in color. So these are just two examples of the whites and sulphurs. So you've got cabbage whites, which are the ones that I have to go check for eggs every day on my broccoli plants because they love to eat anything in that family. And then a facultate orange tip, which I think is one of the most colorful of the whites and sulphurs. A few of the other ones, clouded sulphurs, all of these sulphurs and oranges can be really difficult to tell apart. Some of them you actually have to handle them to be able to tell them apart. But if you can narrow it down to this group of butterflies, then you're really a step above most people that are looking at these. So if you to point out is, so the clouded sulphur is fairly common. This one is really cool. This is a southern dog face, and it gets its name because of the dog face here. So it's got an black ear and a black eye, and then this is its snout here. And you can actually see it when its wings are open or when its wings are closed. So that's just kind of a unique characteristic in how it got its name as well. Okay, the Gossamer Wings is our next group of butterflies we're going to talk about that are found here in the Mid-South. These ones are typically small and brightly colored. They include ones that are known as harvesters, coppers, hair streaks, and blues. They're usually about the size of a nickel. But what's really interesting is if you look at them really close, or if you're out catching butterflies and you look at them up close, their legs are actually striped black and white, which is a unique characteristic of this group of butterflies. Another really unique thing about this group of butterflies is that a lot of the caterpillars and the chrysalis have a mutualistic relationship with the ants. And what that is basically the ants protect them. So the chrysalis and the caterpillars can sometimes make a squeaking sound that resembles the same sound that an ant in distress can make. And so the ants come and actually protect them from potential predators, which is pretty awesome. Oh, and it includes our only North American butterfly caterpillar that's a carnivore. So remember back when I said, what are the characteristics of butterflies? And one of them was that most of them eat plant material. This is the one exception in North America. This one's a carnivore. The caterpillars actually eat aphids. And the way that they do it is, you can see in this picture, is they actually will camouflage as aphids. The adult butterfly lays the eggs in an area where aphids are. And then when it hatches out, the caterpillar actually starts to eat those aphids. So our only North American butterfly caterpillar, that is a carnivore. Hair streaks, you probably see these guys around. They're little and colorful. What's interesting is when we get into some of these smaller butterflies, there's a lot of stuff that we actually don't know about them still. So for example, the red banded hair streak, which is one that we can see around here quite a bit, they are not sure what its host plant is. And so that's, I think in Butterflies of Tennessee, I think they say that's a great master's research project for somebody too. The juniper hair streak, they do know that one gets its name because the caterpillars only feed on red cedar. The blues is another group in this Gossamer Wings, and they typically, sometimes people call them azures or blues, and they typically do have that blue color. So you have spring azures and summer, and those both, their host plant is dogwoods. Eastern tailed blue, Lespedeza, including the introduced species, alfalfa, tick trefoils, clover, and vetch are some of its host plants. All right, the next category is the brushfoots, and this is basically everything else. But the one unique characteristic that they share is they all have furry front feet. And so that's where they get the name brushfoot. This one's really cool. This one's an American snout and gets his name because he's got this long extension here that kind of looks like a snout. And snouts are found, not the American snout, but there are snouts that are found actually on every continent. So it's a pretty wide distribution for butterflies. This also includes our Gulf fritillary, and then it includes another small group that kind of look like skippers, but they get lumped into the brushfoots. Question marks and commas are two that fall into this category. These are really interesting. They're ones where the adults don't necessarily feed on nectar, but instead they feed on tree sap and rotting fruit, especially persimmons. The caterpillars feed on hackberry, elms, and nettle, but they get their name question mark and comma because when their wings are closed, you can see this one here, it's got a small question mark. So it's this little silver C, and it kind of looks more like a semicolon, but they call it a question mark. And then the comma has got kind of a nice C shape here without this extra dot. And so that's actually how they get their common names. And both of those can be found around here as well. So our monarchs, right? We just talked a lot about those. One thing I probably forgot to mention was how to tell the males from the females. So when you're looking at a monarch, and if you see these two kind of swollen dots here, that is a male. Those are scent pouches, and only the males have those. If those are not present, then you're looking at a female monarch. And then here's what the caterpillars look like. And of course, their host plant is milkweed. This is a viceroy. Now, viceroys can look very similar. Some of the differences, the main difference is the viceroy has got this black line that goes across its bottom wings. They also tend to be a little bit smaller, and their flight is more erratic. And so when you see a monarch fly, especially like from a distance, they have kind of more of like a floating kind of lazier flight. And that's mainly because they have that toxicity from eating milkweed plants. But the viceroy does not have that. And so they have more of an erratic, rapid flight. They're also one of the caterpillars that are the bird dropping ones. So this is the caterpillar here that looks like a bird dropping. Buckeyes and Admirals also fall into this group. So red admirals are named so because they've got a really thick red line that you can see here. And they're on false nettle. That's what they're laying eggs on. But they can have a few other host plants, but that's one of their main ones. A buckeye, named a buckeye because of these eye spots here. And this is a Landsleaf coreopsis, I believe it's on. And their host plants are plantains. We also have American and painted ladies. And even for me, I find these two really difficult to tell apart. And so hopefully this screen isn't too overwhelming. On this side here, we have the American lady, and on this side, the painted lady. So American ladies just have a few eye spots, where our painted ladies have like four versus 2. And then also the painted ladies don't have a white spot in this particular cell. If you can narrow it down to an American or a painted lady, I think you're doing a great job. Their host plants are going to be thistles. Red spotted purple, right? When you first see this caterpillar, it is not purple, or I'm sorry, this butterfly, it is not purple, but it does have the name red spotted purple. It does have the red spots, but it's not a purple color. It's more of like an iridescent blue. I don't really know why they decided to call it purple instead of blue. American hornbeam is one of their host plants. And this is one of the really cool ones that actually will overwinter in the late caterpillar stage and one of those rolled leaf tubes. And so this is one that is a little bit of a different overwintering strategy than we see in most caterpillar or most butterflies. Another way to tell this apart from some of the other black with blue butterflies, these guys do not have tails like the swallowtails. So that's one way you can tell it apart. Emperors, if you have a hackberry tree in your yard or even in your neighborhood, you have probably seen these. They are tied pretty closely to hackberry trees. And these are the ones too that sometimes will land on you quite a bit. And one of the reasons that butterflies land on you is that they are actually getting, especially if you're sweating, they're getting salts and minerals from your skin. And so that's why they're landing on you. All right, so now to our last group here, we've got our skippers. And this is the most common one that I see here, the silver spotted skipper. This is a small butterfly, and they're called skippers because it does look like they kind of skip from one plant to another. But the silver spotted skipper has got this big kind of white splash mark on the side. There's 43 species in Tennessee, and they show mainly characteristics of butterflies, but their really hairy bodies are kind of indicative of moths, but they are classified as butterflies. The long-tailed skipper, this one is, I think, one of the most attractive skippers, but I wanted to point this out, which I found this caterpillar. And when I first, this is on tick trefoil. And so when I first saw it, all I saw were these two red spots on a black head. At the time, I didn't know it was a black head. And to me, it looked just like a black widow spider, the abdomen that shows the red hourglass. It looked just like that. But what it turned out to be was actually the head of this long-tailed skipper caterpillar. And so they probably do that as a mimicry, as a way to protect them from potential predators. But I just thought that was super cool finding that. Some other skippers that we've got the hoary edge one. And that also has the host plant of some of the trefoils, which are, some people call them beggar's lice. And if you are working in the garden or hiking and it's anywhere around this time of year, you'll get covered in these. So looks very similar to me the other day. Common checkered skipper. This one's really pretty because most of our skippers look like this, right? Kind of a brownish, maybe a gold fleck to them. But this one's a little bit unique in that it's black and white. This is on mistflower, and I will tell you, I have a patch of mistflower at my house, and it was the last couple of days, it has been covered in skippers. Not other butterflies, but probably I think 4 or 5 different species of skippers and about 15 individuals, which is pretty cool. Their host plants are in the mallow family, both introduced species and the native species they'll use. The last group of skippers, I'm not going to go through like have 20 different pictures of all of them because they all kind of resemble each other. But these are the grass skippers, and they all fall into this group of grass skippers because of what their host plants are. So we've got a leaf skipper here, and that's on any of the panicum grasses and blue stems. And then fiery skippers actually lay on crabgrass. So how can we attract? So now we've kind of talked a little bit more about all the different butterflies and some of the unique characteristics of them and their life cycles. So how can we get more butterflies in our yard? And so one of the ways that a lot of people don't think about when we talk about, anytime I talk about attracting an animal to a certain area, you have to think about what their habitat is, right? So you have to think about food, shelter, water, and space to raise their young. And so talking about water, butterflies do not go down to bird baths. They typically will go to wet rocks, or they will puddle in areas like this, which has got some wet sand, some rocks, and a little bit of water. You don't want to put too much water in it because they need a landing platform, but they will get most of their water and minerals from puddling in these kind of muddy or wet sand areas. So when we talk about them, I always like to promote planting native plants, plants that do well in this area, plants that have adapted to, and both have adapted plants and butterflies to each other, and host plants. But when you're thinking about that, you want to think about where do you want to plant stuff. So what's your location? Sunny locations are going to work the best for most of the native plants for butterflies, but also planting in clumps. So if you think about a butterfly flying over your yard, you want to draw them in, and sometimes just one or two blooms is not enough to get them to focus in on your yard. So planting in clumps can really draw in the butterflies. Remember that if you get a host plant, that it may get eaten. Years ago, I did a project at a senior living facility. We planted a bunch of different host plants and nectar plants for butterflies. We did a nice butterfly garden, and we got a call from the staff there. The residents were really upset because these plants that we had planted were getting eaten up. And so we went back and we showed them the caterpillars, and they were fine with it then. But just remember that if you do get a host plant, for example, the Passionvine, I showed you of the Gulf fritillary caterpillars on there. It's almost all completely eaten at this point. So just one of the things, if you're going to plant a host plant, keep in mind that it may get eaten. Remember to include host and nectar plants, and you want to plant for continual bloom. So some of these butterflies are going to be active more in the early spring, some of them in the summer, and some right now. So we're still seeing monarchs pass through our area. So they do need some of that fuel, which would be in the nectar plants, that nectar sources that you can plant. And don't forget about trees. Some of these species do have host plants that are trees, and trees can also provide some cover. A few other garden tips: try to avoid herbicides and pesticides. Pesticides don't always discriminate, they just are insecticides, and so that could affect butterflies and caterpillars. Provide resting spots for the butterflies. So these would be things like large flat rocks in a sunny area. Butterflies like to warm up, especially the red spotted purple. They're known to really sit out on flat rocks and pavement, sunning themselves. Provide a puddling area if you can, and that could be a dish. I forgot to mention the other one is kind of a fountain that splashes water onto rocks, and then the butterflies come down to those rocks. And then providing cover for bad weather, things like snag piles, shrubs, or dense wildflower patches can provide some protection or shelter, like when we talk about the components of a habitat. So that can provide shelter for the butterflies especially during bad weather. Some more specific ones they definitely recommend are the milkweeds. So again, this is for monarchs. Most of them need full sun. There's a few that can tolerate a little bit more of a shady area. And they do see that monarchs do show a preference for some of the different milkweeds. So when we're talking about the native milkweeds, it seems like the swamp milkweed or showy milkweed is a favorite, followed by the common milkweed and then the butterfly weed. Passionvine, again, I mentioned this one a couple of times. Kind of interesting too, if you have this in your yard and you've got the big fruits on it now, the outside, the fleshy part around the seeds inside is actually edible. It's kind of tastes a little citrusy. But yeah, attracts Gulf fritillaries. Buttonbush, this one is great because this is a great nectar source. They kind of put out these like satellite things, satellite balls that have sticky nectar coming out on the outside. So it's a great one for butterflies. And I should say buttonbush too, its growing habits, typically if you see it growing in the wild, it's usually around water, like stream banks or along the Wolf River, places like that. But it can tolerate not being in those environments. So we have one that's planted in one of our parking lot beds and it does great, but it can also withstand wet feet. Some fall blooming nectar ones. This was really cool. I took a walk today just to see what was blooming and what butterflies were around, and any of the asters are going to be attractive to butterflies. The New England aster is blooming right now. That's actually where I saw the monarch today, was on some New England aster. Blazing stars are a little bit past bloom, but they tend to coincide with monarch migration. Goldenrods are in full bloom right now, most of the goldenrods. And then this mistflower too is in full bloom right now and attracting a lot of the skippers, like I mentioned before. But not to forget about our spring blooming nectar too, because this is going to be for some butterflies that are kind of coming out earlier in the spring. And so don't forget about trees. So trees like redbuds provide a lot of nectar when they're blooming. And so that's actually one of the sources of nectar for some of our early butterflies, and as well as the red buckeye. And so red buckeyes are starting to bloom like in April, and that's when some of our first chrysalis are kind of opening up, the ones that have overwintered. Spring beauty, I know a lot of people don't like this. This is a really low growing spring wildflower. A lot of people have in their yards that just gets mowed over. But it is an important early nectar source. When it comes up in one of our spots here at Lichterman Nature Center, it's one of the first one that's blooming. So for those really early butterflies, it's really a crucial nectar source for them. So when I see it, if it's in my yard that I'm about to mow, I'll just dig some up, and I've got one big clump of it. So Jacob's ladder, that's another one of my favorites, and that one is a shade plant, and it's a spring ephemeral. So it's one of those ones that's coming up before the leaves come on, and that one's really good for early butterflies as well. So we have our plant sale. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with that. That's coming up. We do have a new website, so it's now Mosh Memphis. And so Lichterman Nature Center is a part of the Museum of Science and History, and it's rebranded from the Pink Palace. So there is a new website, and that'll have all the information about our upcoming plant sale this spring. Some resources. This is the book I was talking about, Butterflies of Tennessee. It's a great book. It's got a guide to caterpillars in the front. It's organized really easy for anyone to use. So I definitely recommend that one for here in Tennessee. Peterson First Guide to Caterpillars. This is actually a kid's book, but I found it pretty helpful when I first started learning caterpillars. It's got kind of the most common ones to look for. Caterpillars of Eastern North America. This is definitely a way more in-depth one. So if you're really into it, after you get the first guide, look into that one, Caterpillars of Eastern North America. Websites, the North American Butterfly Association. This is if you want to get your garden certified as a butterfly habitat. You can do it through the North American Butterfly Association. You can also log sightings of what butterflies you're seeing, and you can see what other people are seeing, not only in our area, but across North America. If you see something and you're not sure what it is, butterfly-wise or any insect-wise, bugguide.net is a place where you can post pictures, and then it kind of crowdsources and helps identify that for folks. And iNaturalist is kind of the same idea, but it could be with anything, plants or animals. And with that, this is my contact information. If you need to get a hold of me, you can definitely reach me by phone number or email. Okay, let's see. Okay. All right. So the first question that I've got here is about raising monarchs. So do they know how to it's a two-part question. Okay. So my sister in Northeast Pennsylvania raises monarchs and releases them. Do they know how to migrate? Well, it depends when your sister is getting the caterpillars. And then I would assume she's taking them inside and raising them there. The Supergeneration should know how to migrate. So they've done some studies looking at when we do tagging, we actually have to record whether it is a wild one or a reared one. What they are showing is that the reared ones are less successful migrating. They don't know exactly why that is, but there is a statistically significant difference in the survivability of ones that are being raised inside versus outside. Okay, so I have definitely raised them inside and released them, but what I am trying to do now is to keep them outside as much as possible. I don't know if it has something to do with day length or changes in temperature throughout the day, something like that, but there is a little bit of a difference between captive raised and wild, but they all should know how to migrate. Okay, hopefully that answered your question there. Okay, butterfly houses, garden ornament or useful to butterflies. Okay, so the butterfly houses, I think are ornamental. I've not really talked to anybody that has had success getting butterflies to use them. What those are those are really for overwintering adult butterflies, which we do have the morning cloak here, but they tend to just go behind tree bark versus kind of an artificial house. So to me, I think they're ornamental. However, if you're looking for a house to put up, you can always try the ones for native bees. And so those do provide housing. The bees do use those, but houses for the native bees works. Oh, raises them from eggs. Okay. So I do know some people that raise them from eggs with success. But it all has to do if she's up in Northeast Pennsylvania and she is raising them, if she has them in June and July, most of them should know to continue to migrate even further north. So I think even if she's raising them from eggs, what I would recommend if she can is to expose them to the outdoors. So keeping a butterfly enclosure outside instead of inside. Okay, so I haven't had much luck making puddlers that they actually use. Any thoughts on what I might need to make sure of? So a few things for puddling: make sure that it's in the sun. And I would try a few different options. So with the one that I showed the picture of, it is what I like, because then you can kind of get an idea of what the butterflies are really going to. I've also had success with like using more of a mud mixture with sand. So it stays pretty dry. You don't want it like soupy, but you want it to where they can land on it, but stick their proboscis down into that wet sand or mud. Another thing that sometimes people have luck attracting butterflies with is using fruit, like rotting fruit, mashing it up and putting it out in a dish. I get too many fruit flies on that, so I don't really do that. Can caterpillars see? Yes, caterpillars can see. We don't know what their vision, how to really compare that to, say, our vision, but they can see. They have small eyes, and so they can see. Any other questions? Let's see here if we got any more. Okay, well, thank you guys so much for having me here. If you have any other questions, feel free to give me a call if you think of something later, or something in my presentation didn't quite make sense. Feel free to contact me and I'd be happy to talk to you about it.
That's excellent, Mary. Thank you so much. It's really nice to have this presentation, which is really tailored towards the area that we live in and not something generic. So I really appreciated this very much. I will add on the question about the puddling for the butterflies. In your picture, you showed a shallow dish. Any sort of shallow dish like that, whether it's the top of an old bird bath or a planter made for succulents at ground level. Also, since we did have bees a couple months ago, they also need that same, they still want water and they still want minerals and salts. So even if you're not trying to attract butterflies or bees, that's a good thing to have available for insects in general. So appreciate that very much.
Yeah, absolutely. I should have mentioned too, on our water feature we have here at the Backyard Wildlife Center, we have a hive not too far, and the bees come to that water source quite a bit too.
Right.
So all insects really appreciate that.
Great.
But thank you guys so much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thank you very much.